We want to be in Romans chapter 12 tonight, and the verse will be 13. Here in Romans chapter 12, Paul, as he often does, will give various quick applications of teaching here, but there's one particular verse we want to look at, specifically the end of that verse. And there Paul writes that we are to be distributing to the needs of the saints and given to hospitality. Some translations may say practicing or pursuing hospitality. Maybe that's a topic that we don't oftentimes think about as far as living the Christian life and being Christ-like. And I've titled tonight's lesson, The Hospitality Commands, because when we look at the New Testament teaching on hospitality, we find out that it is actually not simply a suggestion or extra credit that we can do on the side to get us bonus points, as if you could get those. But it's part and parcel of the doctrine of Jesus and what we are to be doing as fellow believers. I read an interesting quote, and it's from an interesting book. I would recommend the book. Alexander Strauss wrote a book called The Hospitality Commands. It's not a very big book. It's maybe 100 pages or less. You can get it on Kindle. It's a very good read. But he noted at the beginning of that book that obviously, when you look at the New Testament, he said, hospitality was very important to the early Christians. In fact, New Testament writers, Paul, Peter, and John, and the author of Hebrews, made hospitality a scriptural command, a duty. And when I read that, I wasn't entirely convinced of that. But going through the New Testament and seeing what there is actually said on hospitality, he's correct. Not because he thinks he's correct because it's what the New Testament teaches. So we want to talk a little bit tonight. What is hospitality? What is the New Testament norm? And offer some practical suggestions or applications for us to think about how we can become more hospitable. So with that, let's just start. What is hospitality? Well, in the Greek, it comes from really two different words. Philo, love, and then xena, of strangers. So if you're going to be super rigid and really blocking your translation, it'd be love of strangers. You expand that concept out. It's love of brethren, it's hospitable to brethren, it's also love of strangers and being welcoming and encouraging and offering refreshment and comfort to strangers at the core level there. One writer said that hospitality is the generous and gracious treatment of guests. Another way of thinking about it is to provide refreshment. And I'm not talking about little sandwiches and little teas. It's to allow the space for somebody to rejuvenate themselves, maybe after traveling, maybe they're a guest at a congregation, maybe they've traveled, they're passing through town and they need a place to rest for the night. It's to provide that the refreshment, the gracious treatment of your guests. And this is kind of a lost art form among believers, unfortunately. You could talk to your grandparents or your parents of them growing up in a time, if they're in a Christian household, where they remember frequently entertaining guests, having them stay over the night if they're traveling through. This was something that was part of not just the Christian community a century ago or a generation ago, but also just the larger community at large. This was a practice that our culture has kind of gone away from, and I could talk ad nauseum of reasons for that. We're living very segmented lives. We're living very disconnected lives now. And so this is really an area of Christian service where we can really show the light of Christ in this world, because the whole act of hospitality kind of runs countercultural right now to how our culture operates. We put our guests up in hotels. We might send them a gift card or something if we do anything. We keep them at arm's length because, my place might be too small, or we have kids at home, or whatever it may be. And I'm not making any judgments there. Each family has to make a decision on their own on that. But we've kind of removed the hospitality from the home, from our practice. And instead of realizing it's a function of the Christian family, of individuals as well. We're not going to go through all these verses. I just want to put this up on the board for you, and it is in the outline if you want to get a bulletin on the way out. But this is basic, a representative survey of the Bible teaching on that. As early as Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, we see what the Old Testament practice of hospitality was. In Old Testament times, not only was it the generous treatment of guests, but it also meant that they came underneath your protection. So in Genesis 18, that's the chapter where Abraham is given the promise that he and Sarai will have a son. And he's told by two messengers of the Lord. Well, they're coming by, and Abraham implored them to stop and come by the wayside and rest, and he prepared food for them and had his servants wash their feet. He'd provide refreshment, and he graciously treated them. It's not on the board, but think about Lot when he's in Sodom, and the two messengers come. Part of that incident, and we can have a different discussion on that, but when they came into his home and the mob wanted to get the guests, Lot acts as a protector of his guests. That was part of the ancient Near East custom of hospitality, what that meant. You not only refresh them, but they were part of your unit, kind of there for a little bit. It's interesting in Leviticus, we just got done reading as a congregation, there were several commands about treatment of the stranger and the alien resident in the land of Israel. They were to treat them fairly and generously. They were to provide. There were some provisions there for their sustenance and so forth. They were to have equal treatment underneath the law, that the Gentile wasn't to have a separate law in Israel than what the Jews had. There was supposed to be a generous treatment of this guest in the nation. In Romans, as we read in Romans chapter 12 and verse 13, again, given to, continued in, pursuing hospitality. It's a goal, it's a practice that the early church was involved in. And we do want to read Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 12, or verse 2, excuse me. One of the more interesting statements in Scripture, because the Hebrew writer provides no explanation of what's meant here, other than he says in verse 2, or they say in verse 2, do not forget to entertain strangers, some translations say, practice hospitality. For by doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Now you can take that two different ways. Either way, no matter how you slice that, you've provided hospitality for messengers of God, whether they be itinerant preachers or these divine beings. I lean more on the itinerant preacher side, but that's kind of not underneath the purview of this lesson. The point is, the Hebrew are just, hey, don't forget, be hospitable. You don't know if you provide refreshment for one of God's people by doing so. And in New Testament times, there's a big reason for this. And we saw that in ancient Near East times and Old Testament times as well. There was no Holiday Inn that Paul could have stayed at. And inns in the ancient world up until actually modern times were not a family-friendly environment. You think of everything that could have gone on in Las Vegas, it was happening at the inn. And that was really no place for a Christian to stay. That was no place for anyone who cared about virtue to really stay. So there's that aspect as well, why hospitality is so emphasized in the New Testament. But also, it's just who God is. He graciously and generously treats those who are strangers to himself. I think about what Jesus said in the Gospels, that God sends the rains upon the just and the unjust. You know, there is a degree of generous treatment that God gives even to non-believers for their benefit, that they might become believers. And so that's why there's such this big emphasis on hospitality. If God does that with us, we need to be able to do that with each other. Now, what we see in the New Testament, this was the norm, and while hospitality is not always mentioned, that word, the concept is there. For example, at the end of the book of Romans, in chapter 16, verse 16, we see that in New Testament times that they greeted one another like family would. There was that connection, even if they had never met the brethren before. In Romans 16:16, there we read, "Greet one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ greet you." That holy kiss there, again, we Americans have sometimes a a wrong picture when we read that. Unfortunately, that act has been overly sexualized in our culture. Think of the French custom as kind of the quick little peck on the cheek. This is that kind of custom. It was a familial greeting that reserved really only for family. And Paul is reminding them that that kind of greeting, a familial greeting, is right and proper for brethren and brothers and sisters in the Lord. Again, we don't practice that today because it was a unique custom for that time. We have different ways of doing that. We have different ways of greeting family, oftentimes by a bear hug or something. And Paul would say the same thing. We need to be that kind of welcoming to other members of the family. Even if we've never met them physically before, they're still family if they're in the Lord. But we find that the New Testament church did that. We find that they shared their possessions. Again, that's part of hospitality, of the generous and gracious treatment of strangers. It's sharing with them to maybe in their hurt or their needs. I think of the book of Acts in chapter 2, for example. Acts chapter 2 in the verses 44 and 45. There we're told, now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among them as anyone had need. And mind you, in Acts 2, most of these brethren are strangers to each other. They had all traveled into Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost, one of the festivals that Jews were required to be at the temple for. They had overstayed what they had planned and saved for. So there was a real need. There was a need of perhaps clothing or food or whatever it was. There was a gracious and generous treatment of these people who are now brethren in the Lord, but still kind of strangers. And you see that too back in Romans 12 and verse 13, distributing or contributing to the needs of the saints, that generous treatment. We see that they opened their homes to the church. Back in the book of Romans in chapter 16, and we're looking at verse 5. Romans 16, and the verse will be 5. Back in verse 3, he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in the Lord in Christ Jesus, commends their work in verse 4. Verse 5, likewise greet the church that is in their house. Now, I don't know about you. Some of you have been to my house. I think we could all fit over there for services. It'd be very cramped. You'd really get to know each other. There would be no personal space. But think about that practice in the early church. There was no dedicated meeting house yet, at least not at Rome. There were brethren who were opening their homes week after week, and when things got really tough, sometimes even putting their family at risk for persecution by providing that meeting place. But they opened their homes up, and was customary in Roman times, the host would provide all that was necessary for the meeting. So there's personal cost involved here. Think of what they would need for the Lord's Supper. Perhaps making sure there's adequate seating or where they need to gather. That was just kind of the expectation of being hospitable in the ancient world, was the host provided all that was needed for the occasion. And even later in the first century, the early church had this practice where the rich brethren, as part of the means of benevolence, would put on a feast. So the poor brethren could come over and eat for the day if they had nothing to eat. There was that practice we see of them trying to apply the New Testament teaching of being hospitable, contributing to the needs of the saints. They did that. In Acts 2 and verse 46, one of the things we note there, that they were taking their meals together day by day and from house to house. They wanted to be together more than just the assembly. And again, as we said, they had a practice of opening their homes, of generous treatment and gracious treatment of guests. This was part of their lives. And this is something that I preached on before, I'll preach on again, I'll keep preaching on. I'm trying to practice it better. I know you all are trying to practice it better. But this is a practice that the modern church struggles in. Alexander Strauch, at the beginning of his book, relays one really heartbreaking story, in my opinion, and one I can empathize with. There was an older widow who had been attending this congregation for almost 2 years. And finally, at the end of 2 years, she had announced that she was moving to move in with her daughter, and she was moving out of the state. And so one of the sisters had her over for lunch. And this older widow had commented that that was the first time in 2 years anyone had ever invited her over. And what she used to do in between services, she would just go to the park and sit and watch the birds. Now that sounds nice in March, but think about during December when it's cold and wet, maybe at this part of the country, or when it's snowing. Here was a sister that had gone 2 whole years, and the only connection she ever had with her brethren was attending services. This is an important thing. When we come together as the gathered body to worship, that's important. Don't get me wrong. Don't mistake me on that. That should be the highlight and the kickstart to our week. But that should not be the only time we have with each other. And I will tell you, I have been a visiting preacher at some congregations where, and we don't preach for the meal, we don't preach for the paycheck. That's not why we do that. But it's a little awkward when I'm left there standing, I blinked, and the congregation's gone, the building's not locked up, and I have nowhere to go for the next 6 hours before evening services. Now I pray, and I haven't seen it, we don't do that. And if we have, maybe repent of that and do better. But that shouldn't be the norm. In fact, what I would like to see, and I have seen at times where our guests are sometimes overwhelmed with 2 or 3 invitations. Come over, rest for a little bit, let us refresh you. Now, I will say on the flip side, for every negative story I might have experienced, I have 2 or 3 positive ones. And I have been greatly refreshed in my time traveling and preaching by brethren who have graciously opened their homes. And I know some of you have had the same experiences when you're traveling. People that you've never met physically before treating you like family because that's what you are. You are part of the family of God. And that's a good thing. But that was part of their norm. That's how they lived life. And this is because hospitality is deeply and primarily rooted in our love of God and of each other. If you look at the greater context of Romans chapter 12, the commands to be hospitable always appear kind of in close proximity to some sort of command or admonition to love one another. Back up a couple verses in Romans 12, and we see in verse 9 that we are to let love be without hypocrisy. We are to abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. We are to be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. And then just a couple verses later is where we get practicing hospitality. And there's other passages we could cite of that. But this love has to be primarily rooted in God. And that's where it comes from. As the apostle of love, John says in 1 John 4 and verse 19, that we love because he first loved us. And so when we understand deeply God's love for us and his gracious treatment of us when we were strangers, that should transform how I interact with my brethren and my fellow man who may or may not be a brother or sister in Christ. John says in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, he says, Jesus says here, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And Peter adds to that same theme in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. He says, since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible through the word of God, which lives and abides forever. Again, John, Peter, the rest of the New Testament makes that connection, when we understand the love of God for us, that will change how we interact with each other. And hospitality is simply one of the ways that we show love, and love is poured out towards our fellow man and fellow believers. And so maybe we're struggling a little bit with hospitality. Maybe it's an area that maybe we haven't thought about, an area that we need to grow in. And it looks differently for everybody. It's kind of hard to open your home if you're in a one-bedroom apartment. I recognize that. But there's different ways we can do it. But you can be hospitable without necessarily having to open your home and put on a big feast. There's different ways of doing that. Sometimes it's just sitting there and being a listening and compassionate ear for somebody to talk to, or a shoulder to cry on. Sometimes it's on the receiving end of somebody who wants to be hospitable and they've invited all these guests, and it's you saying yes. That's just as important. But maybe you're struggling even with the motivation to say yes, or even put on a feast, or have somebody over for dinner, or whatever it may be. Start with the love of God. When we grasp God's love for us, when we were strangers and enemies and far from Him, and His gracious treatment of us, that will help us start to graciously treat other people. I want to close with a few practical suggestions tonight. First and foremost is I just need to be open to hospitality. And what I mean by that, if somebody invites me over, out, to whatever it is, somebody's trying to be hospitable and I've been the recipient of that, or potential recipient of it, to the best of my ability. I know there's some obligations that we cannot cancel and move around, but to the best of my ability, I need to try and say yes. I remember early on when I started preaching, I was at a congregation, and one of the deacons, him and his wife, decided to put on a big spaghetti feed for all the kind of young people. They just, that whole weird category of 20 to upwards of 40 sometimes. And there was a pretty big list that got invited. And I show up, I'm getting ready for a fun night. We've got to be people my age, get to know this new deacon, all that stuff, and I was the only one. Besides the deacon and his wife, of course. Now I could tell, maybe it hurt them a little bit because they had gone through all this trouble, invite all these people. There was still a blessing in that. I got to really know that deacon and his wife really well that night. And they loaded me up with a ton of extra spaghetti. I could not eat it all, and spaghetti does not reheat well. At least for me, it doesn't. But I need to be open to hospitality to the best of my ability, because we need to appreciate that what happens is, and yeah, maybe we can say it shouldn't be this way, but it is. If somebody works up the courage maybe to actually do that for the first time, they put all the preparation, and no one comes, no one says yes, that can be really discouraging. And that can hamper their efforts next time to do that. Again, should it be that way? I'm going to reserve judgment on that. But that is how it is sometimes, where people get discouraged. The inverse is true. If you put on a whole thing or invite people out and they say yes and you have a grand old time, guess what? You want to do that again. And it just becomes part of your life. So be open to it. Secondly, plan to be hospitable. Kind of like you make your monthly budget or something else like that, or you want to go on vacation. If you find a way to plan and be determined and put the date on the calendar, you're going to make it happen. Maybe you reserve the second Sunday of every month. We're going to have visitors over for lunch. We're going to do chili or something, a cheap meal that you can feed a lot of people. My great-grandparents did that. They always planned. The traditional Sunday chicken, they were always going to invite visitors over. And if they couldn't invite the visitor, they got the preacher or another member. There's always somebody that's going to say yes if you can't get your target person. And so just plan to be that. And maybe you're in a situation where maybe you can't cook, maybe you shouldn't cook. I'm not going to. Hey, let's go out today. You might go to a cheap burger joint or something. It's not the quality of the food per se, as long as no one gets sick. It's the time spent together. In fact, I read the story of a woman who was going to a women's conference, and one of the keynote speakers had this glowing reputation for just being just renowned for her hospitality. And one of the breakup sessions, they were going to go over to her home, and she really wanted to go and see what that was. And so she comes over, and this woman's in the living room with some other women talking Bible, and there's a basket of dirty laundry on the table. There's some kids' toys kind of thrown everywhere. And the woman says, "Oh, come on in. Help yourself. There's some leftover pizza in the fridge, and grab some and come on in." And this woman realized at that moment, it wasn't the fancy feast that you put on. It wasn't how clean the home was. It was just being there and opening up for the conversations and the relationships to develop. And so sometimes we overcomplicate hospitality, when sometimes it's as simple as some leftover pizza and a place to sit and talk. If I had my own translation, which I shouldn't, think back to Martha and Mary. When Martha's running around like a chicken with its head cut off and she's worried about getting the food on for Jesus and all that stuff, I can hear Jesus say in Brendan's paraphrase, Martha, just calm down. You're trying to get the Sunday roast ready. Little Caesars would have been fine. Just come here and sit and listen. And sometimes we overcomplicate hospitality, and we don't need to. Thirdly, make a list of those who would be encouraged by your efforts. Maybe it's new converts. Maybe it's the single people in the church. Maybe it's those who are widowed or widowers who maybe struggle during the holiday season because they don't have their spouse or family members around. Maybe it's people who live very far away from their family, who can't easily get back during those time periods. Those are the times where hospitality really becomes important. I jokingly refer to it, but on Mother's Day and Father's Day, there's a number of us in this congregation that we can't go home on those days. It's not easy, so I call it the Orphans Club on those days. I'm like, we get together and we go out and we go do something. We remind each other to call Mom and Dad on the respective holidays, but it's times like that where maybe we don't think about that. Maybe it's just somebody that just needs a friend, or somebody you enjoy spending time with. You know best the people in your life that you can serve. But think about maybe the 2 to 3, maybe 5 people that you could have over. Maybe go out to eat someplace, go for a walk in the park, or just being there with them and build that relationship over this next year. And that goes to this final thing. Just hospitality at its core is just being genuinely interested in the lives of people. What concerns them, what's going well for them, what they're struggling with, their prayer needs, whatever it may be. And a shared meal, a shared activity simply is the means to get to know them. And that's really what hospitality affords us. It affords us the shared activity to get to know this other soul sitting across from us. The kitchen table, the shared activity, is the most important tool in growing as a disciple, in evangelizing, in teaching. You name the area, the kitchen table can be the most important tool we have. And it can be as simple as you invite your neighbor over for some iced tea and you just get to know them. But take a genuine interest in people's lives. C.S. Lewis remarked one time, there's no such thing as an ordinary human being, for all of us are immortal, and that makes us special. And if we approach life like that and recognizing that we have met no mere mortal, all of us will exist for eternity, I don't think any of us would pass up on the opportunity to get to know another immortal being, which we all are. We're all going to eternity somewhere. And we all have such unique experiences in life lived that if we just take the moment to sit down and listen, we'll be surprised at what we find out in the best possible way. And so I hope these practical suggestions are helpful. Again, hospitality looks different for everybody. Whether you're single, married, have a home, apartment, whatever it may be, there's ways for you to do that. And that core of just generous and gracious treatment of guests, even when they are here in the assembly. I know I've emphasized a lot the home, but the assembly matters too. And I keep referencing back to the fact that God was gracious in his treatment towards us when we were strangers to him. I think of no greater passage than that in Romans chapter 5, that when we were still strangers or without strength, God sent his Son, who died for us while we were his enemies. And he was risen that he might pardon us and can give us life eternal. And we can have that relationship. We can be recipients of that gracious treatment if we name the name of Christ, confess him, turn from our life of sin, and become united with him in the waters of baptism. If you have done that in the past and are in need of help, we can pray with you, we can pray for you. We can only help you, though, if you come forward now. Let's we stand and sing the song that's been selected.